consumers say that they want the food that they eat to be more environmentally and socially sustainable, but they often don't understand enough about how food is produced to really know exactly what that means. They also, when they say they're willing to pay more, I think anyone operating in a grocery environment today or watching some of the world news would say anybody saying they're willing to pay more is just not paying attention to how everyone reacted to inflation recently, right? So they're saying they're willing to pay more, but really, are they willing to spend a higher percentage of their income on food to make that a reality?
Welcome to the first in a series of special sustainability podcasts on the Wisenetics podcast properties. My name is David Dayhoff. I'm the North American Director of Sustainability and Precision Services with DSM-Firmenich Animal Nutrition. And I'm happy here to welcome my guest, Sasha Duchnowski. He is a partner with Bain Company. So welcome, Sasha.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you, David.
Yeah, thanks a lot. No, this is really interesting. Hopefully we'll have a chance. A lot of the listeners, don't typically we talk a lot on these podcasts about finer points of animal nutrition and the animal agriculture industry. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to learn more maybe about the broader ecosystem and food and ag companies. And so I'm really, really happy that you're joining us today. So speaking of which, though, a lot of the listeners to this podcast may not be very familiar with Bain. So why don't you say a little bit about you and your role and what you do at Bain?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. So as you said, I'm a partner with Bain Company. It's a consulting firm. I've been with the company for 20 years now, based now in Chicago, but have worked out of a number of our offices globally. And I tend to focus on agriculture and food and then chemicals. And what I do and what Bain does in general is we provide consulting services to companies that are looking to make big decisions or bold moves. And so I often focus on strategy. We, Bain, also cover operational topics, technology topics, things like that. So a company that is looking to do something like large mergers and acquisitions, or enter a new country and come up with a growth strategy for that, thinking about new technology deployments. How do I incorporate generative AI into the way that my company operates? Those sorts of questions will help companies think through how exactly to do that. And our goal is to help them create more value for their shareholders at the end of the day.
Beta-carotene impacts reproductive performance in cattle. Because the main sources of beta-carotene are forages, most cattle don't get enough. Victus Transition from DSM-Firmenich contains a blend of beta-carotene and mixed tocopherols, which provide needed vitamin A and antioxidants. Victus Transition provides better embryonic transfer and reproductive performance. Make sure your cattle get the beta-carotene they need with Victus Transition. Visit dsm.com/Victus Transition.
And so with that said, we didn't really talk about animal agriculture or sustainability in that you mentioned you work with food and ag companies. So tell me a little bit more about your work in the sustainability space and how that factors into what you just described.
Yeah, happy to. So over the course of the past, almost a decade now, one of the things that has been increasing in consideration for many companies across more than just agricultural and chemicals, but especially in energy and natural resource sectors, is a recognition that there's a significant impact on society in a variety of ways based on how those industries operate and how companies within those industries operate. And the topic started with carbon, but has expanded to other topics as well, like water and biodiversity. And in the early stages, it was a lot of just understanding what the impact of various different activities, what that was. But as consumers have become more aware of some of those impacts, as regulators have become more aware of some of those impacts, there's been a lot more attention to what choices do companies need to make about how and where they operate in order to potentially address some of those topics directly, or at least have a smaller impact on some of those environmental or social factors that are increasingly becoming top of mind for people in the ecosystem.
Got it. So, you mentioned in your intro that a lot of your practice is working with food and agriculture companies. So when you are in those kinds of discussions with those companies, what do you see as really the big drivers that is now making this important, in the last decade, that when you're doing a strategy practice or other kinds of, market entry or the things that you described, where does sustainability factor into that and what's really driving it?
In a lot of the topics that we're talking about with companies, we're thinking about how is a particular industry going to evolve as potentially some of these topics gain momentum or gain magnitude in the minds of people who are influencing the way the industry evolves. And so if I'm working in oil and gas right now, as a different example, I might be thinking about how carbon regulations are going to change. I might be thinking about how sustainable aviation fuel markets are going to evolve in Europe and the rest of the world. Especially in food and agriculture, there's a number of ecosystems that a lot of companies are thinking about surety of supply issues. So if we want to continue to grow, is there going to be enough wild caught tuna 20, 30 years from now? What are the things that we're doing that are influencing those outcomes, and how should we as a company interact differently with all of the other companies that potentially play a role in how volatile that is, what the total cost of it is, how available it is in the future? Thinking a lot more longer term, but in some instances thinking relatively near term as people consider things like drought issues and changes in weather patterns and risks associated with those sorts of things. So at the end of the day, it's really about a couple things. One, it's making sure that the industries that we operate in today are going to have attractive dynamics in the future. And then I think the second thing is also people are becoming more aware and consumers are becoming more aware of these topics. And so how do we operate a company that people feel good buying from, providing a product that people feel good buying and consuming? And so all of those things matter in this discussion.
Now, that's one of the points that I wanted to pick up on, and that I was interested in the work that you've done with companies. We talk about the drivers, and sometimes it's related to, you mentioned it could be regulations, or maybe there's shareholder pressure or NGOs, but then there's the consumer part of this argument too. I know that you have done some research that Bain has in the past for something called the say-do gap. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, maybe I'll just explain in general what the say-do gap is to start. So it's observable when you do consumer research that consumers will say that they will do things differently than they actually do them, right? So if you say, Sasha, how many times do you intend to work out this week? I might say 3 or 4, and then I might not even get close to that, right? And it's because my intentions or my view of what I should be doing are different than the decisions that I make in the moment. I may say, hey, I really care about the sustainability of the seafood that I'm going to buy. But then when I get to the store, I'm looking at everything and I'm like, man, that price just looks really good. I'm going to go with that, even though my intentions walking in may have been a little bit different. So that the way that shows up is when you do consumer research, consumers say they'll do something, and then when you actually watch what they buy, the way they behave, they do something meaningfully different. Particularly for this issue, one of the things that is readily observable, and many people will talk about, is that consumers say they want products, especially food products, to be healthier, more nutritious, more sustainable, and all of those attributes. What you observe when you look broadly at the food ecosystem is that indulgence and convenience are actually the things that are driving a lot of the purchase, right? It's those things at conflict with good taste or stuff like that. Those are the things in the moment where, we say we want to order a salad, and then we go and we think, man, but I really want to eat something else right now, right? And so it shows up in a lot of different ways, but we've had to do a lot of digging into that in order to really understand how some of those dynamics play out. So a couple of the things that we've observed is, one, consumers say that they want the food that they eat to be more environmentally and socially sustainable, but they often don't understand enough about how food is produced to really know exactly what that means. They also, when they say they're willing to pay more, I think anyone operating in a grocery environment today or watching some of the world news would say anybody saying they're willing to pay more is just not paying attention to how everyone reacted to inflation recently, right? So they're saying they're willing to pay more, but really, are they willing to spend a higher percentage of their income on food to make that a reality? One of the observed things that we've observed is the answer is actually yes, just not as much as that food is being offered for in the market today in terms of premium. Me saying I want to eat chocolate or that's made from cocoa that was not deforested and the farmers were paid a fair wage doesn't necessarily mean I want to pay 6 or 7 or 8 times the cost of the chocolate bar. That's also not what's required in order to accomplish those things that I just said usually. So there's a mismatch between the premiums that are being charged and what consumers are willing to pay. So the say-do gap has some nuance to it.
No, that's super interesting. And one of the things I wanted to discuss with you today, in my role, I spend a lot of time attending animal agriculture industry events or feed industry events. Sometimes I'm even a speaker or presenter at that. And I frequently get, sometimes live from the audience and occasionally more often in the halls afterwards, some version of someone coming up to me and saying, David, all this like sustainable stuff when it comes to the way people buy meat, like is there really anything there? Isn't this a bunch of like fluffy PR for the companies? Like, do consumers really care about this? And so what I'm hearing you say is that if you were advising somebody on a strategy related to animal protein products or something like that, there would be a sort of yes, but answer. That yes, it matters, but you got to contextualize it some. Is that correct? And say more about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think maybe a couple things to add on to that. There are, one, these topics are nuanced by region around the world, right? Europe and North America are very different places on some of these topics. Asia, South America, Africa, also very different places on some of these topics. So I'll talk a little bit. Most of where I work is North America, Europe, and South America. But so there's some nuances. I think the yes, but is I don't think it's appropriate to say, I don't think the right strategy, maybe is a better way to say it. I don't think the right strategy is to have two types of products offered on the market. One is something which just has no indication of how it is grown, what practices were used in order to get it to market. And then the other one is the super premium, we sang a nice lullaby to this animal every night to make sure that it felt great. It's not the extremes, right? And so there's multiple people beyond animal agriculture that make decisions on what this can look like. It's not just the consumer, it's also the customer in terms of the retailer that's offering it, especially if it's unbranded meat, as well as regulators who are trying to set standards that all of us as individuals are both citizens and consumers in the places that we live typically. And so there's a lot of other stakeholders. And so I think, being able to say, I have practices that are going to reduce the risk that someone takes a picture of what's happening in a production environment and posts it on whatever social media platform is top of mind for people whenever you listen to this. And that becomes a negative PR event. Companies care about that stuff, right? And then as a consumer, to say that I wouldn't feel better about buying based on my consumer perception a product that was ethically sourced using practices that if I observed, I would feel good about. To say that I wouldn't want to feel a little bit better about buying that product, I think it may not be on offer predominantly today, but that doesn't mean that there's not, it doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity to offer that, right? And so a lot of the conversation that we have is the people who can position the product to the consumer are the retailers and the consumer products companies. The people who can change the practices as to aligning it with how it's being presented to the consumers are the animal agriculture producers. right now, those interactions are largely commodity interactions, right? It's like, this is the grade of what I made, and here's how. Maybe there's some certifications it could qualify for, but in general, in the longer term, we see the potential opportunity to align production practices with customer buying criteria. There's maybe some certain practices I don't want in my supply chain anymore, and I'm the one buying it and putting it in the tray pack and offering it to consumers, so I get to dictate that, or at least ask for it. And you can tell me how much it costs. And then also, downstream with the consumer, being able to say, just think about the a consumer saying, I would prefer something as grass fed versus grain fed. People will understand the difference of that, and they'll have a mental picture in their head of what that means, right or wrong. To them, the perception is a reality, and if they feel better about themselves, even a little bit, picking up that product and consuming it, just think about how many purchases we make every day, just based on how good we feel about making the purchase. To say that that wouldn't exist in meat, I think is just missing a potential opportunity that I think might be getting bigger over time.
To try and separate this a little bit too, I don't know if you have examples or experience in your work. We're talking more about the demand from the consumers. How much of it is also at more the boardroom level? There is on behalf of the whole company's image rather than the image of the product on the shelf for the consumers. And, you mentioned, like earlier, you were giving an example about, is there something that would show up on social media and there'd be a bad social media event or something like that? But more writ large, do you see any divergence between what the shareholders and the executives are thinking, or the executives are thinking about regarding the shareholders, totally separate from, regardless of what the consumers believe, I need to do this on behalf of managing the reputation of the company?
I think there are some topics that are going to align with corporate goals driven by corporate positioning on topics like sustainability. Some companies call it regeneration, things like that. I also think regulators are looking at these topics differently, right? And so if I am a company and I'm a European-based consumer products company, and I have stated goals aligned with where I think the regulation is going around decarbonization, especially scope 3 decarbonization, which would mean everything that exists before I'm making the product. If I've set goals associated with that, and I look at where are all the carbon emissions coming from that I think might impose some cost on me in the future, it's going to be very hard to be a food company and not see animal agriculture, especially ruminant animal agriculture, and dairy, especially as big sources of carbon upstream. Now, that may motivate me to start to have conversations with producers around, well, what were some of the grazing management practices that exist upstream? How do the various different growers in this ecosystem perform on those things? That might in the future create some incentive to have methane inhibition products added to the feed, even if we don't see very many productivity enhancements or other benefits from it other than a reduction in carbon. And so some of those things might happen unbeknownst to consumers, but they're aligning with overall corporate goals. The barrier to that, the difficulty is not just making the business case pencil in terms of what do I have to believe about the proximity of carbon taxes or anything like that. It may also be, is my procurement organization even set up to purchase meat and dairy products in a way that asks these questions and gathers the information in a way that's not cost prohibitive to me? Because for every producer out there that's thinking, I have to change all these things, that's complicated and expensive, it's much easier to just buy USDA choice graded trim specification meat and just put it in a tray pack and move on, versus having to understand all of these things about how it's grown. So I think there's some motivation there, but there's also some complexity and some cost, which is why it might feel like even today there's a disconnect between what companies are saying publicly and what they're actually doing, because they have a bunch of people internally to their own companies that they need to align on. How are we actually going to do this thing that we just committed to? And it might take a couple of years to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point that you just mentioned too. The two different things. One was around the cost, and then one was the actual ability to implement it. Without going into anything proprietary, to double back on earlier in the call, you mentioned that consumers are, or at least some consumers are willing to pay somewhat of a premium. It's just typically not as much as a lot of the supply chain thinks is the case. Do you have any sort of ballpark ranges, or is there any kind of sustainability premium that is out there that is kind of a generally accepted, like once you go beyond this, all of a sudden you've lost, it's too much cost for the chain to bear?
Yes. And so when we do broad surveys and we do what we feel like is a good job of positioning what sustainability means, we get to something like a premium of 5 to 10%. What we see in terms of like what are consumers actually being asked to pay, it can be more like 30 to 35%. Right. And so that's where there's a disconnect, where even if they say they're not going to do in that sort of environment. I think the other thing that we've observed is that consumers may not really understand how food is produced. And so it's not just that it has to be more sustainable. It's that you have to communicate to them that it aligns with their broader, what they're looking for, including sustainability attributes, without how much room is there on a can of tuna to describe how it was caught, right? Like that's a pretty small package. You can't really say a lot on it. So this communication is also, for the CP consumer products companies to figure out, but that's something that needs to happen. That needs to happen as well. And I think one of the other things that is a barrier, even when I say 5 to 10%, that's on the product on shelf. And I think this is one of the things that's missed in this discussion quite a bit, which is there's a lot of products where if you look at what percentage of the product on shelf is the agricultural raw material actually a part of. If you go to the store and you buy a loaf of bread, how much does it cost? And what percentage of that was the purchase of the wheat? If you go to the store and you buy a can of tuna and you say, what percentage of that was the purchase, pre-canning and all of that of the tuna fish from a boat out in the West Pacific? Sometimes that's only 20 or 25%, even if conceptually we think of bread as being primarily wheat or a can of tuna as being primarily tuna. And so the fact that a consumer would be willing to pay, even call it 3 or 4 or 5% more, translates back to a meaningful ability to invest in the growing ecosystem in order to drive the types of practices that would make a consumer willing to pay for that. It is just really hard to get that consumer 3%, 4% all the way back to the farmer or the producer that's raising that animal, catching that fish, growing that crop, managing that orchard, whatever it is. Because if you don't have, our food systems are set up with huge pipelines of food production and manufacture in between them. If you don't have sufficient volume, if you're not moving it through at scale with throughput, those economics can go, that 3% can get eaten up even before you get back to the food production system relatively easily. So this is a very hard issue to actually wrestle to the ground. But again, the conversation around this stuff, I think, has been going up and down, and there's been some fits and starts to it, but it's been generally moving in this direction for quite a while now. So I think it's fair to assume that this conversation around how we do this will continue.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting thing that a lot of people don't appreciate as much, but it's more obvious, I think, to people involved in animal agriculture versus your point that consumers a lot of times don't actually understand how the food was produced or what does that really mean. And so either they just kind of gloss over it or they have a mental model for it that may or may not be anywhere close to reality or not. But unlike what you're just describing about the loaf of bread, if we talk about, a tray pack of chicken breasts or a ham or something like that, right? Like a very high percentage of that product in the end is typically going to be the production of the animals itself and back at the animal production and the animal feed level as well. And that's, one of the things I think this audience, as I mentioned before, listening to this podcast, is a lot of people are typically involved back at that part of the supply chain. You're actually making feed, raising animals, set in large, sure, there are some niche programs, and I'm sure there's some people who listen to this podcast that are focused more on a particular niche kind of brand versus very large scale production of chicken or pigs and chicken or eggs as well, obviously beef and dairy. But if you wanted to know, based upon where you sit and you're out there talking to people that are branded food companies, retailers, quick serve restaurants or restaurants, And I think sometimes there is some, not out of bad intent or anything, but there's just a loss of the messaging getting back to the people actually working in, barns and feed mills. So, if you wanted to communicate something about what the consumers and the customers downstream are driven by, and then speak to this audience, like what role do they play, or what messages would you have for them, for people that are nutritionists and veterinarians and operations managers, people like that? What would be some of the things that you'd like to share with them?
I just want to highlight one of the things you said about the difficulty in the message getting back. I think there's one of the things I see in the food companies that I work with quite a bit is we think of companies as one unified brain. And it's like this company is interacting with me. The reality is companies are made up of a lot of different sub factions within them, right? And so you may have someone who is thinking about the next 10 years of whatever consumer products company, where am I going to position this company strategically relative to other companies in my industry? My long-term vision is this. That means this is what I want. And then there's then there's someone who is the sustainability person, or is doing all of the reporting on this topic, or is doing investor relations. And they're saying, okay, this is what we're going to do over the next 3 to 5 years. And then you have a procurement person who's like, well, this is what I need to buy the next quarter. And like, that's all great. But like, honestly, like my incentive is like, I'm going to do as much as I can to get 1/10 of a cent out of your per pound price. And like, I'm going to really, really, work you on that. And so often what happens is what we read about and what we hear about is senior executives talking about the longer term strategy. We see chief sustainability officers and other people at conferences talking about the direction they want the company to go in. But like we upstream are then interacting with procurement, who is not aligned. And I think the other thing that I've observed as I work with across the agricultural system, but then also with food companies, is that many of the people saying those things about the longer term, where they want it to go, don't understand the trade-offs that have to be made in order to deliver on that. And they don't understand the economics, and they don't understand, well, what is just someone trying to eke out an extra 1/10 of a cent on their own production versus what is really a cost in the system that needs to be borne because of something that I'm asking for. And so, and the other last observation I would say is many of the things that people think of as the first steps in greater environmental sustainability in animal agriculture are also things that are correlated with higher productivity, right? So it's getting the right feed into the animal to get the right average daily gain, the right feed conversion ratios, those sorts of things. Driving higher productivity makes animals less resource intensive, which is ultimately what we're trying to get at, right? And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that the industry is already doing just from an efficiency perspective. From an efficiency perspective, all industries are probably getting 1% to 2% less carbon intensive over time on average because we're becoming more productive over time. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that is not at conflict, right? And then I think the other thing that can help is just making it clear what are the things that can be done. And sometimes there's people that can sit in the middle and help have this conversation. Some people are members of co-ops, and there's actually someone else representing them in some of these conversations. And you can having discussions around what is the art of the possible, as we would say, what are, if we could get to world-class grazing management programs all across my state, what is the impact of that? Because like actually a lot of us should want to do that anyway. And so I think just continuing the conversation and not making it, like I said before, it's either there's no conversation about this or it's like all of the green people on their soapboxes. It's like there's something in the middle, which is like, how do we all collectively want these industries to move forward? And by the way, like I said, like a lot of the rationale for this is not just, there's consumers out there who are idiotically willing to pay for some of the stuff that doesn't matter. It's actually, a lot of it is also around supply chain resilience. It's around, protecting from risks of things like droughts and stuff like that. Like ketchup companies want to keep buying tomatoes, right? And so, and they come from a place in California that has really high drought risk. So there's a lot of motivations for this conversation that aren't, that shouldn't be happening at the negotiation table. That's the wrong place for them. But there's opportunities for conversations across the industry as to where it's going to evolve.
Along those lines, and I don't know if you have specific examples, you mentioned earlier in like really when we started this conversation, carbon was kind of the big driver, but there's more. There's other things. There's water, there's biodiversity. And in the example you just gave, which I also talk about that all the time. And I think there's a pretty good understanding in the animal ag space that the heart of most sustainability programs is in fact the efficiency, the things you talked about, like getting better at it. But then you do see some of these trends, like a trade-off of, let's say, animal welfare versus carbon footprint of the popularity of slow-growing birds or something like that, right? And this idea of a trade-off that do customers or consumers ultimately really understand that some of the things that might fulfill one need, like a consumer perception, right or wrong, about animal welfare might come at a cost of higher carbon footprint. Do you get a sense of animal welfare versus environmental footprint, or the ability of the companies in the middle between us, if you will, as the animal ag industry and the producers of understanding those trade-offs yet?
I don't think the understanding of those trade-offs is very high. And I also think, based on my own experience, that when confronted with those realities in a fact-based way, I think the people who are pushing and not understanding the trade-offs today will acknowledge that they exist in the future, right? And so I think maybe a couple things. One, there's always going to be a part of this conversation that feels crazy to people who understand how production actually works. Right? And so, like, if you just remove that stuff from the conversation for a second. And one of the conversations that I had, so I did a project in Ecuador on shrimp aquaculture. And we were talking about things like, well, what level of pond intensity can we get to? What impact does that have on the water that's eventually going to be released back into the ocean when we harvest the pond? What are the things that we can do to minimize the impact of that? And it was really just really what happened at the end of the day was we weren't talking about anything that cost all that much more, actually. And in fact, as we talked about pond intensification and more sophisticated farming techniques, the productivity was going up. The cost was staying the same or coming down, and creating investment opportunity to mitigate some of these other impacts, reinvest in mangrove reforestation and things like that. And so the conversation had to be had, though, because if it's a procurement negotiation, as I said before, then you're not going to get far. And so I think there's the problem is there's not very many places where those conversations can productively happen today, which I think is going to be one of the big barriers we're going to have to get over in the coming years if we're going to make meaningful progress on aligning what companies downstream are asking for on these topics versus what producers and people operating upstream that are listening in right now, what can they do in order to make those things work? One of the things that I thought was really insightful was if you look at dairy carbon footprint as an example globally, it is much higher in places like China. Why is it higher in places like China? Breed selection, feeding predominantly, right? If you look at shrimp aquaculture production, it's way more resource intensive on smallholder farms in India and Thailand and places like that. Why? Because they don't have the technology installed. And so actually our first thing to do is usually deploy the stuff that we already know how to do. It's not going to crazy new technologies or getting into insane trade-offs that don't make any sense. We actually have a lot of room to move just on proliferating or expanding or installing more of the stuff that we already know how to do.
That's really helpful. And it's also you articulated in a different way what I mentioned. I experience a lot on the conference circuit, if you will, that sometimes people just think this is just crazy talk. Like, what, don't these people understand that? But then I was at a conference too, that there was and this is kind of a final question, as well as if there's anything else that we haven't covered in this conversation that you'd like to share. But I was at a conference that there's a well-known speaker, Frank Mitloehner, who's from UC Davis's Clear Center, and he talked to me. I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but we have to not suck at talking to consumers. Like, there's a lot of people in the animal ag sector that just don't want to talk about it or feel very uncomfortable being more transparent about what they're doing. And he actually saw it as an opportunity. Like, get over it. If that's what you think, get over it, because that's not the world that we're going to live in. But also don't view it as something that is inherently actually a hard thing to do, because if we can talk about it a little bit better, farmers actually have a tremendous amount of credibility still, generally speaking, with the vast majority of consumers. So I don't know, do you also see that opportunity to, let's not suck at talking to our customers about what we do?
I do think that there's an opportunity for industry groups, industry associations, co-ops, major companies in this space to drive some of the conversation of what good looks like, right? Like, just think about the consumer response to certified Black Angus, right? That was a conversation about a attribute that drove quality, this specifically around breed, or think about all of the conversation that goes on, rightly or wrongly, around grass-fed versus grain-fed, right? Around things like that. There's an opportunity to explain to consumers what we think good looks like. I mean, when I grew up, there were the beef, it's what's for dinner commercials. There were dairy commercials. There were things that you were a conversation with the consumer around these product categories and these goods and how they're produced and why they're good. And like, you should consume them. And I think there's a role for that in the market that balances all of these considerations and kind of at least explains the perspective of the producer, not just, it shouldn't just be the environmentalist NGO that's dominating the conversation. And the reaction from industry shouldn't be entirely defensive either.
I think that's an important message too, that it's not just it's not that, similar to what you said, that before, there's not just either we do and say nothing, or we have to go all in and do every 100% absolute, to the most minute degree of sustainability related production. There's a middle ground on it too. And I think that's an important part too, that those of us involved in production agriculture, getting out there doesn't mean completely getting out there and getting excessively, investing too much in it, trying to tell the story to the nth degree. But if you don't try to tell the story at all, then the story is going to get told for you by other people. And I think that's what we need to get better at too. So yeah. Well, Sasha, this has been a super interesting conversation. I really, really appreciate your time. And thank you very much. And look forward to seeing you again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.